Our next lecture in Unit 8 will focus on population ecology and taking a look at the effect of population density on population growth. We have two learning objectives for this lecture and lesson. First, to describe factors that influence the growth dynamics of populations and explain how the density of a population affects and is determined by resource availability. We open our lecture here with an image of the wolves of Yellowstone, an interesting reintroduction program that occurred in Yellowstone National Park in the 1990s. Wolves, about 50 years prior to that, were removed from the park, and it led to some pretty devastating effects on the populations of other animals and even the ecology of the park. It was clear that the loss of that important keystone predator affected the park negatively, and wolves were reintroduced and more or less restored the ecological balance of Yellowstone National Park. So it's a very interesting story, and we may touch on it a little bit as we go through this lecture. So let's first understand what a population is. We're talking about a group of interbreeding individuals that are of the same species and live in the same habitat at the same time. So an example could be water lilies in a lake. It also could be the number of humans that live in New York City. Population ecology is basically taking up the study of factors that would affect population size and how it changes. It uses the tools of what we call demography. So you may have heard of demographics when we talk about human population growth. So we use those same terms when studying wild populations. So it involves the use of birth rates, death rates, age distributions, and even migration patterns of the animals that might be moving around. Density is basically the number of organisms that are in a given unit area or volume of water at a given time. And so that can change over time as a population grows and the habitat remains the same, or it could also change as a result of the habitat becoming smaller or larger. Density also gives us interesting dispersion patterns. We see three examples here. We have clumped, uniform, and random dispersion patterns seen in living things. And these happen for a number of reasons. If we look at a clumped distribution here, you can see all those trees growing clumped together in this quite arid desert landscape. And that's basically because that's where the water is. The little bit of water that might be present in this desert is right there. So this is kind of what we call an oasis, if you've ever heard that term before. Clump distribution is very common because resources tend to be clustered in an area. Wherever you have water, nutrients, whatever the case may be. Social behaviors may also promote this pattern, such as fish schooling in the ocean, right? So they want to stay together to avoid predation. Also, you can have birds flock together for mating purposes as well. Speaking of birds, you can see these gannets here are displaying uniform distribution. This is usually the result of competition, and what you see going on here with these birds, these seabirds known as gannets, is they're all basically building nesting sites, but they have a very dense population, and so they equally space out, and it's pretty interesting. The space between their individual nests usually corresponds to how far they can reach each other with their bills to peck each other, so that results in a uniform distribution. Random is quite rare because resources are rarely random. But it can occur where there are abundant resources, such as you can see the sheep grazing on this field. There's plenty of grass. They're just kind of motoring about here and eating wherever they may please. So that results in random distribution. Survivorship is an important component of populations because how long an organism lives and its chances of dying influence population growth. So we talk about birth rate obviously would add to a population, well, death rate would take it away. And so the survivorship curves are very, very important. And there's three types of survivorship curve. They're named type 1, 2, and 3. So in a type 1 survivorship curve, most of the individuals die very late in life. So like we'll get and this is typical of large mammals like hippos. They have a lot of parental care, so their survivorship when they're young is very high, and they tend not to die till late in life. Humans would also be an example of a type 1 survivorship. In type 2, there is a uniform rate of decline, meaning your chances of dying are the same when you're young as you are when you're old. So there's no, it's basically a straight line of decline. Type 3 is where you have a large decline in young, meaning your chances, your mortality rate is much higher when you're young. So a lot of the larvae of the moth you see here would be consumed or eaten. So their chances of making it to adulthood are quite rare, but once they do, they tend to live for a while. Let's look at an example of a beaver here. So what kind of survivorship do you see for Mr. Beaver? Well, if you said type 2, that's good. Yep, you can see it's pretty much a uniform decline of survivorship over time. So a good example there. Now let's talk about how populations grow. And so really the simplistic formula for this, the simplest way to look at this is birth rate minus death rate, right? Okay, so the change in numbers would be your population, how many individuals are in a population over a given time, right? And that's going to be equal to the number of births minus the number of deaths. But it is rarely that simple. And so we have to add in some components here, right? So notice here we're looking at the change in time divided into the change in population size. And then of course B and D are the birth rate and death rate. This is kind of just the basic equation. We're going to come back and use some of these terms and reorganize them algebraically to understand the two models of population growth. So there's generally two ways or models that describe how a population would grow, and they're based off of resource availability. Exponential growth occurs when resources are not limiting, right? There's plenty of resources, so the population can grow very fast. Logistic growth is when resources become limited, and therefore the population growth rate changes and may be limited. Let's talk about exponential growth first. So we mentioned that we were going to change that population equation a little bit. And so here you can see we've changed some. We still have the change in numbers over change in time, right? So population size is the n, and then we have the change of time. Now, R max has been introduced here, right? So R max is the maximum per capita growth rate of the population. This is also known sometimes as the intrinsic growth rate. This is how fast the population is growing. So if R is 0, there would be no growth in the population. It would stay the same. If R was negative, the population would decline. If R is positive, it will increase, and the higher the R value, the faster the population will grow exponentially. Now, you can see, so as R increases, the population will grow more rapidly. But what exponential growth rate assumes is that the R value is consistent, meaning in this more solid or thicker red line here, we're assuming that the intrinsic growth rate of this population is always 1 and is not changing. And as a result, it's growing exponentially, giving us this, what we call a J curve. Because population growth rate depends on the value of n, meaning the existing population size, and as well as the growth rate, or how fast it's growing, the population will increase faster and faster over time. Okay, so that is known as exponential growth rate. Now, this isn't always the way populations grow. Most populations don't grow this way. We'll take a look at some examples of that, but there are some natural examples of exponential growth. Um, so here we're looking at elk populations in Yellowstone. I had mentioned those, right? So you notice that the elk population was growing exponentially when wolves, which was their main predator, were removed from Yellowstone National Park. There was nothing that was limiting them. They had no predators, and there was plenty of vegetation for them to feed on. In fact, the elk population grew so rapidly that they started to decimate the tree populations. And a lot of the plant vegetation was disappearing to the point where even rivers were eroding and becoming polluted with sediment. So that is an example of exponential growth. Now, interestingly, in the 1990s, when some wolves were brought down from Canada and reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park, notice we see they had an exponential growth rate too throughout the 90s and into 2000. So really, part of the reason for that was they were a small population in this huge park, and there were plenty of elk for them to feed on. Um, of course, it didn't always stay this way, and we'll talk about what happens to a population when resources become limited. When a resource becomes limited, we call this logistic growth. And so when resources such as water or space or food becomes limited, then the growth rate will decrease. So exponential growth assumes that the R is always constant. Logistic growth rate tells us that it's going to change, that the growth rate, a population will grow when there's an abundance, and it will grow slowly when there is not an abundance of resources. Often what happens is a population will reach its carrying capacity, which is the total population a given environment can support. So here is the logistic growth equation. You'll notice it has the same basic bones as the other equations, but it's a little bit more complicated because we're introducing K into this equation, which is the carrying capacity. When you graph the logistic growth of a population, this is what you see. So exponential growth, right, that gave us this J curve, right? It's growing faster and faster. R is constant, never changing. The blue line here is showing you logistic growth. Notice it starts out growing exponentially, but then it hits its maximum growth rate right here, and then all of a sudden the carrying capacity starts to come into play, and that's going to decrease the rate at which the population grows, and eventually it'll level out at its carrying capacity. Now, moving forward, it's pretty significant that we look at these two letters R and K. You'll see at the end of the lecture why these two variables have so much power over the type of strategies organisms use to reproduce. Now, logistic growth doesn't always look like a S-shaped curve like you saw on that previous slide. So sometimes it will, right? Sometimes there will be like a true S curve. Like this is looking at a growth of bacteria in a culture, right? Or I'm sorry, yeast cells. I'm sorry, not bacteria. Yeast cells in a culture, right? You can see they grow exponentially at first, hit their maximum growth rate, and then level out at the carrying capacity, basically because you're limited in space and the amount of sugar that might be available for the population. Sometimes you might have what we call overshoot. And this is looking at Daphnia in a culture, like this is a little water flea. And so basically you can see it's growing exponentially, and then it has overshot its carrying capacity, and then notice the R value would actually then become negative, causing the population to decline to stabilize at the carrying capacity. Here we're seeing what logistic growth might look like in breeding male fur seals, right? So notice that the line is more or less showing you a trend. It's like a trend line, right? You can have some overshoot and some time lags here, but eventually you kind of see where that pattern is. So it's not always going to be graphed like a perfect S-shaped curve like this. It might have some overshoot or be some spread in the numbers. Let's now talk about why carrying capacities exist, or the factors that would affect and limit population density. So there are generally two types of factors that limit populations. And that is, the first type is density dependent factors, meaning that the population density, or excuse me, these factors become more of an issue as the population grows and we have a higher population density. Sometimes it's easier to define density dependent factors with their examples. So for example, we're looking here at mule deer are competing with elk for food, right? So basically the larger the population, the more competition there is for that resource. So the larger the population, the more fierce the competition, and it limits the population size. Disease becomes much more of a problem in larger populations. It spreads more easily in large population of elk. Predators also become much more successful when the population growth is high. So if there's more prey, such as the wolves in Yellowstone when they were first introduced, they were able to hunt down and capture a lot of prey, and that started to limit the population of the elk. Now the other type of factors that limit population are known as density independent, meaning it doesn't matter how big the population is, it's going to limit it. These tend to be like natural disasters or some sort of physical factor in the environment. So we see here a fire, a forest fire, that's going to limit a big population or a small population. It certainly just won't matter. The flooding in an area from storms, right, that'll limit any population. And an avalanche. Those are all good examples of factors that would affect big and small or high density and low density populations. It doesn't matter. So if we were to graph these two factors, looking at how they become, how they affect mortality with their change in population density, you'll notice that density-dependent factors become more of an issue. Mortality increases as populations get bigger. In independent factors, again, population density has zero effect on mortality. So again, a drought would affect any individual in the population. It just simply wouldn't matter. So now let's take a look at what we call the life history strategies, how population growth seems to shape the behavior and reproductive abilities of certain species. So there's a couple of different strategies. We have what are called R-selected species. Their strategy is to have a high rate of population growth. So what they're doing, the reason we call them R, and notice it's a lowercase r, so in your notes make sure you write a lowercase r. They're trying to maximize the population growth rate. Okay, so we look at, in an example in plants, weeds are a great example. We look at the dandelion weed here. Lots of small seeds, they disperse very easily, they tend to be small, they grow fast, and they don't live very long. So our selected species, basically their strategy is to just reproduce as quickly as they can. So we're looking at an example in plants here. In animals, this would be like mosquitoes, right? Mosquitoes are very small. They grow really quick. They don't live very long. And after it rains, man, they reproduce like crazy. So they are selected. A lot of things low on the food chain tend to be our selected species. K-selected species are more stable populations. These are species that are just trying to exist at a carrying capacity. That's why they are called K-selected. And notice the K is capitalized now to denote that their strategy is to get to the carrying capacity. So if we go back to plants, look at a plant example, these would be like large trees, right? They're very large, they grow very slow, they live thousands and thousands of years, They have very large seeds that don't really have good seed dispersal. They just fall on the ground right below the tree, so there's not a lot of seed dispersal. In animal populations, this would be like large mammals that invest a lot of parental care. They have a few offspring. They take care of them and make sure they reach adulthood more so than, say, mosquitoes or small bait fish. So humans would be a good example of K-selected species. We have a few offspring and we care for them and make sure that they can reach adulthood more successfully. When you graph the population, when you look at the population growth curve of these two strategists, you can see a couple of different key features. In our selected species, for example, mosquitoes will reproduce and grow exponentially. So let's just say it rained, and that's what mosquitoes need. They need puddles and little ephemeral pools of water. Well, they would reproduce like crazy, and they would overshoot their carrying capacity. And then they would die very quickly, whether they're preyed upon by other insects, or maybe a pesticide is sprayed in the area, or they just simply die because they're not very long-lived species. They crash, and then it rains again, and they reproduce, and then crash. So it's very unstable. Bait fish would be a good example of this, right? If we have a school of anchovies, it's huge, right? It's overshot the carrying capacity. Predators come in and feed on the anchovies, and their population crashes. Then they reproduce like crazy. They can lay thousands of eggs at a time. So you have this unstable population where you have an overshoot and a crash. Now, K-selected species, like large mammals and predators, these would have exponential growth at first, but then once they reach the carrying capacity, there's a little overshoot and a little undershoot, but it basically kind of follows the carrying capacity or exists near it, and it's much more stable. And so that's the difference between what we call an R-selected and K-selected species.